And now I'd like to have Pam Soltis come up and give her presentation. You can read all about her in the brochure. Joe?
Well, many thanks, Bob, for the introduction and also for the invitation to participate in this conference. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. And I'd also like to start off by really acknowledging Ken and Bob for those blockbuster presentations to start off our day. So thanks very much to you guys for getting us started. I also really feel that they set me up perfectly. I also am an optimist, so I think that fits in well with the theme that we started off the day with, despite the scope of the problems that we're facing. So my title is about ecosystems, but we're really going to, okay, thanks. I maybe thought that needed to happen. Thank you. I wanted to focus on ecosystems more broadly, but my expertise is really in plants. And so I think this actually makes a lot of sense, and you'll see why in just a few minutes. So my subtitle is Florida Plants and Climate Change. Now, the overview of my presentation is shown here. We're going to start off with a very, very brief introduction to Florida's iconic biodiversity. You all know what a great place we live in, but we'll just start with that. And then we'll relate that to the underlying plant diversity that supports all of the rest of the life on our planet, but also in Florida. And then we'll focus a little bit on how Florida's plants are projected to respond to climate change. And we'll use some very superficial attention to some climate models and some plant distribution models. And then we'll conclude with how these projected changes in plant diversity may have impacts on the rest of Florida's biodiversity. So don't we live in a great place? We're surrounded by amazing wildlife. We can see just a few of the species of this iconic biodiversity here, and you saw images of many more species in the previous talks as well. But what you may not be aware of is the fact that as Floridians, we actually live in not one, but two biodiversity hotspots. Southern Florida is part of the biodiversity hotspot that encompasses the Caribbean, and most of the rest of the state is part of the North Atlantic coastal plain, or North American coastal plain biodiversity hotspot. And that latter hotspot was just recognized about 10 years ago as the 36th global biodiversity hotspot. So out of all of the world, there are only 36 such named biodiversity hotspots, and Florida is actually home to 2 of them. So even if we aren't happy enough or satisfied with our own recognition of the amazing biodiversity in our state, global experts have also identified the amazing biodiversity of Florida as a key element of global biodiversity. Now, among these many species of absolute beauty and charisma, about 150 of them are federally or state endangered. And most of these are large, charismatic vertebrates, but many more species are also on the brink. And a lot of these are things that we may not really notice. They might be obscure insects or small plants, but they're things that make up important contributions to our Florida ecosystems. Now, there are 3 main types of ecosystems in Florida. We have terrestrial ecosystems, we have freshwater ecosystems, and of course, with our 1,300 miles of coastline, we have marine ecosystems. But these ecosystems are highly diverse within themselves, and we have approximately 80 different communities that represent very diverse habitats. These have all been identified, described, and they're the basis of a lot of the scientific research on biodiversity hotspots, response to climate change, and so on. Now, interestingly, these communities are often named based on the underlying vegetation or plant groups that are there. And you may be familiar with some of these. We have things like pine flatwoods or the pine rocklands or the palmetto prairie or upland forest. So I think these names of these biodiverse communities often rely on the underlying plants. And this is why I think there's such an important tie between the plant diversity of our state and the overall biodiversity. Now, plants are, as I've mentioned then, an important foundation for these communities and support the rest of the species that occur within our state. And so they play sort of a supporting role, but they also are biodiversity in their own right. So we have actually about 4,700 species of plants that are either native or naturalized within Florida. This is a huge number. Only Texas and California, which have much greater land area, have more species than the state of Florida within the U.S. And of these 4,700 or so species, about 3,500 or so are native. So the rest of them represent these naturalized species that we heard about earlier today as well. But many of these also are rare, endangered, threatened, and occur nowhere else on the planet. We have a huge number of highly endemic or restricted plant species within Florida, and these are all in need of conservation. And the hotspots of endemism for Florida plants are the Lake Wales Ridge, the Apalachicola, and something's just leaving my mind here. And the Keys, sorry. Should have thought of that one. So we have these biodiverse hotspots for plant diversity, and a lot of this then drives the rest of the biodiversity in this state. So how do plants grow where they grow? What are the determining factors? Well, there are a lot of elements that generate the suitability of a species for its particular habitat. And very briefly, these include things like the temperature, the precipitation, and not just the amount of precipitation, but the patterns. When during the year does the precipitation come? The underlying soil is really critical to the types of plants that can grow in an area. Of course, the elevation, and we may think that Florida, we don't have any elevation, but we do have elevation. And in fact, the elevation that we have in Florida may be more consequential than just about anywhere else, maybe even on the planet, because a difference of just a few inches can have a huge consequence for the water relations and how all of the these interactions of these abiotic factors come together. And then the final thing, which we'll just lump into the very broad category of biotic interactions, will include things like the pollinators, the seed dispersers, herbivory patterns, all of these sorts of interactions with other species. Of course, competition within and between species of plants and so on. So there are a lot of biotic interactions that we know are important, but we actually don't know very much about them for more than just a handful of species. So what I'd like to focus on today then from a scientific perspective is how Florida plants are going to respond to climate change. And then we'll take that information and extrapolate onto what the impacts for the biodiversity of the state will eventually be. So how do we know what we think we know about how plants are going to respond? Now, of course, one of the best sources of information is to have some plots of land where we, over long periods of time, monitor what's happening in those locations. We can see how much seed is produced, how many new seedlings are generated, what the reproductive output is, how well those plants perhaps fight off herbivores, how they might fight off invasive species, and so on. And so we can have a very accurate estimation of how those plants might respond over periods of years, decades, and eventually maybe centuries. But again, that's the type of information that, number one, takes a long time. Number two, takes a lot of people. And number three, is very rare for those other two reasons. So we don't really have decades to hundreds of years to monitor how all of these 4,700 species of plants are going to respond to climate change. So we need some proxies. So one of the most amazing sources of information about biodiversity on our planet comes from natural history collections. So how many of you have been to a natural history museum? Right, just about everybody. And you probably think of those museums as the amazing exhibits that tell the story of the dinosaurs or the early local peoples of an area and some of the other aspects of natural history. What you may not be aware of is that most natural history museums also have, behind the scenes, amazing collections of specimens. And those specimens are the best documentation of the distribution of life on Earth. So it turns out that there are somewhere between 3 and 4 billion, that's billion with a B, specimens in the world's natural history collections. And every one of those specimens tells a story about where a species occurred at a particular point in time. In the US, we have somewhere around 1.5 to 2 billion specimens. And these are all found in somewhere around 2,000 natural history collections. So I work at the Florida Museum of Natural History at the University of Florida. This is actually among the top 5 natural history collections in the world in terms of size and number of specimens. We have over 40 million specimens and artifacts in that collection. And almost every one of those specimens tells us information about where it occurred, when it occurred there, and whether or not, by comparison with other specimens, that species still occurs in that particular area. So we can actually rely on centuries worth of data from scientists who came long before us to help us harness all of this information about distributions and figure out how Florida plants are going to make it in the future. That may seem like a stretch, but I'm going to walk you through the logic and some of the examples to show how we can actually take advantage of centuries worth of science in order to project the future. Okay, so how do we predict plant distributions? So in the world's natural history collections, there are about 400 million plant specimens in what we call herbaria. The herbaria are the specialized parts of natural history collections that house the plants. And just about always, these plant specimens are prepared and collected and processed in the same way. So you can see here an example of a pitcher plant, which comes from the Florida Panhandle. And in these herbaria, then, we have pressed, dried plants that are then glued or taped or somehow affixed to very standardized pieces of paper. And almost always in the lower right-hand corner in that red circle is information about that collection. So it'll have the species name, it will have the county, if it's from the US, it will have the county where it was collected, it will have the date of collection, it will have the collector's name. If we're lucky, there's information on there about the specifics of where it was found, along some ditch or stream or roadside or something like that. And if we're really, really lucky, that label may contain information about the other species that are growing with it. So we can learn a little bit actually about the community that is that was growing with that specimen when it was collected. Now, this is great because there are 400 million of these, but until the last couple of decades, all of those specimens were housed very neatly in closed cabinets within the herbaria in the natural history museums, which meant that the only way you could get that information out was to visit those collections. Now, that, of course, takes a lot of time, takes a lot of money, and it restricts the activity to those with the resources who can actually afford to do that. So fortunately, about 15 to 20 years ago, the National Science Foundation decided that it's a shame that we are not putting these resources to better use for studies of natural history, biodiversity, ecology, conservation, and so on. And so over $100 million was invested in ramping up what we call the digitization process for the U.S. collections. And so at just about any collection that you visit today, there's been at least some effort to database all that information that's in that red circle for the plants and the similar sorts of labels for all of the animals in the collections. And very rapidly, though, this turned from just databasing the information into a giant spreadsheet to actually also imaging the specimens, which means that we now have images of about 60 million plant specimens. We also have vocalizations from birds and frogs and other insects. There's also video for various animal species so that we can follow some of their behaviors. So this digitization now incorporates not just databasing, but also imaging. And we can use that information also for studies of biodiversity and conservation. Okay, but back to our theme. How do we predict the distributions from this information? Well, one of the really cool things is that for recent collections, there are usually GPS coordinates that are included in that label information. And that means we can put the spot where any particular specimen was collected right on the map. And hopefully you can see a little red dot up in the panhandle that corresponds to the location where that specimen originated. So what does that mean? Well, fortunately, we have databases of all sorts of other information that can help us with understanding the abiotic environment, that is the non-biological environment that surrounds and supports every specimen. So, for example, there's a database that shows the temperature, precipitation, elevation, and a few other characteristics for basically any point on the map. And so when we know where a specimen occurred, we can extract the climate information for that particular location. Likewise, we can say what kind of soil was supporting that particular specimen, what's the soil characteristics, and we could go to another database such as soil grids, and that can tell us the information about the soil. So we can take all of this information together and we can say, here's the temperature, here's the precipitation, here's the elevation, here's the soil, whatever information we can come up with, and we can use an actually AI-based modeling system, which has been around for almost 20 years, and we can model the habitat requirements for any species. And then we can say, where on the map do those habitat characteristics occur? That's our projection of the current distribution. And then we can say, under climate models in the future, where will those habitat characteristics be found? So we can both characterize the current distribution and we can leap into the future based on climate models and say, where will those characteristics occur in the future? And we can look at the difference to then say, whoa, that's where a plant would ideally grow in the future. And if maybe it's here and it's currently here. So how would it get there? Does it need assisted migration? Is there any chance that that plant could naturally make it to a location that would be suitable for it in the future? Okay, so let's take a look at a couple of examples. So this is the eastern dogwood. It actually gets down into about central Florida in terms of its natural distribution, but it occurs throughout much of eastern North America. And you can see in the little map at the right, this is from USF's Atlas of Florida Plants that has this information for all Florida plant species. You can see what counties it's been documented in based on the herbarium specimens from both the state and beyond. And then we can plot on a map where those specimens, all the specimens we have, can be found. And that's that very colored map there that shows many, many different points, basically all on top of each other. And then we can use those points to get the climate information, the temperature, precipitation, the elevation, the soil, all of those sorts of things. And we can develop a habitat suitability model or species distribution model and see where the best locations are for that species, let's say in Florida. And that's what the map in the lower right is showing. We can then ask, where will those conditions occur in the future? Okay, so let's look at some real examples here. So this is the flat spike sedge. It's a relative of the grass, and it occurs in southern Florida and also into the Caribbean and even into northern South America. But if we do this modeling exercise and look for where the optimal habitat is for this species, we can see that it's limited to that very small area of Southeast Florida, where the warm colors are. The red, orange, and yellow represent the highest habitat suitability for this species. Now, if you're a plant, that's not really a very good place to have your most suitable habitat, because, of course, a lot of that is under pavement. But that aside, where does the future climate suggest the optimal habitat will be? So we can model this for periods of like 2050, 2070, 2080, 2100, and so on. And if we look at the model for 2050, we can see that, in fact, there are no warm colors in that map at all. That means there's no suitable habitat left for this species. And this is sea level rise, urban development, et cetera, aside. This is just based on climate. There's no suitable habitat for this species in 2050. A pretty sad story, right? It's not the only one, and as you'll see in just a minute. But let's look at another example. This is the scrub plum. It comes from Central Florida, approximately on the Lake Wales Ridge. It's restricted to a small area. And if we look at its optimal habitat now, we can see that the yellows and so are found in the central part of the state essentially along Lake Wales Ridge. But let's look and see what happens to that in the future. Look at this. In 2050, as our climate gets hotter and drier, the suitable habitat for this species is going to expand tremendously. It doesn't mean that the plant, which is a low-lying plant with these fruits, is going to be able to get to all of those locations, but it does mean at least that there will be suitable habitat. Now, this is a bit hopeful. It doesn't mean that everything is going to go extinct under climate projections for our state, but we can see that there are a lot of projected changes. So if we did this experiment for 1,500 of Florida's plant species, and we can see in the green areas where there's high species diversity, in the tan areas where there's low species diversity. And this is just based on our models for the present. So we can see mostly in the northern half of the state, we see higher species diversity than in the southern half of the state. But then if we do the same experiment for the future, and then look at the difference between the future distribution and the current distribution in terms of optimal habitat, we see this. So here, green represents an increase in species diversity. That means areas where, if possible, plants would move into, and tan areas representing areas where plants might move out of. And so what we see is that area of high species diversity on the left is now tan. So it's lost it would lose a large number of species. That is, if the species could actually move, or perhaps they might go extinct. But if we look to the south, interestingly, the habitat suitability is increased. Now that's suggesting that maybe there are plant species that occur in the central part of the state that would find the area to the south potentially more suitable. This is sort of the opposite of what we might expect. We typically expect plant species in the northern hemisphere to have their optimal habitat moving north. As temperatures are increasing, they're going to, if they can, track the temperatures and move northward. And that's why we can see along the Georgia border, we see that increase in species diversity. But here in South Florida, we see a potential increase in species diversity. And this is interesting because I think in the presentation that Bob showed us, he showed that there are changes in precipitation patterns. And one of the things that we predict here is that there will be changing precipitation that might actually make South Florida more hospitable to some of the species that occur farther north, even though the temperatures are going to be rising. So it's a very complex set of interactions between these various climate components. Mm-hmm. Now, as I mentioned, none of this takes into account the impacts of sea level rise. So, and this map shows projected differences of anywhere from 1 to 5 meters of increased sea level. Now, most models suggest it's probably by the end of the century. Most models suggest maybe between 2 and 3 might be the best. We're hoping for 1 or maybe less if we do some of these mitigation activities. But what you can see is even at these intermediate levels of sea level rise, all of that, all or almost all of that area in South Florida, Everglades and the expanded area around there, will be underwater. And so even though that presents potentially suitable habitat based on climate, that area will not be accessible to most plants or other organisms. And then, of course, we see big impacts along the coasts. So sea level rise has a lot of potential impacts just itself. And these are, of course, the loss of the coastal habitat. If water comes in, then all of that habitat that was previously there will be lost. And this also can lead to increased storm activity, which can then lead to more degradation of habitat. So the loss of the coastal habitat from sea level rise is super important. Also, of course, we will have loss of coral reefs, and we'll hear more about the coral reefs this afternoon. But the climate change and the loss of coral reefs leads to, of course, loss of biodiversity because of the immense diversity that coral reefs support. And also, we see a loss in what are referred to as ecosystem services, or those services that a healthy ecosystem provides that we benefit from. And these also will include things like the decreased flooding, better control of fisheries, and all of those sorts of things. So the loss of ecosystem services is also a huge potential loss. So we have both ecological and economic consequences for sea level rise. And these also, I think, are things that we'll be talking about a little bit more this afternoon. So one of the other impacts of these potential shifts in biodiversity has to do with the potential mismatch of the habitat requirements, the optimal habitat, and the current distribution. So already we've seen over the last several decades that many plants are living in regions that are not their optimal habitat. But how's an oak species, that's occurring in a particular area actually going to entirely move to a new location? That's not going to happen. Maybe there are individuals that can move, but how does a whole species respond to these threats? And then if we look at the potential differences between the optimal habitat, even if the plant is living in it now, and the future locations of those optimal habitats, there's a huge disconnect in many cases. Now, one of the things that often happens then is because of the changing climate, the changing community structure, plant communities become more susceptible to invasive plant species. And I've shown here just a couple of the hundreds of invasive plants that Florida suffers from. So we have the water hyacinth on the left and the Brazilian pepper tree on the right. And these occupy very different elements of our Florida ecosystems, but they're both incredibly destructive to the natural environments and to the underlying species. But we're facing threats of invasive species, not just from invasive plants. Florida is accepting more invasive species than just about anywhere. And we spend hundreds of billions of dollars combating the impact of these invasive species. So, for example, we have insects that come into the country bringing various sorts of pathogens. Of course, we see this in agriculture with citrus greening. We see this in our natural populations through laurel wilt, which is a fungus that's carried by a beetle, and it impacts the vascular system of the laurel family, including the avocado. So again, natural ecosystems, and in this case, also agriculture. And these couple of examples are just the tip of the iceberg. There are so many invasive species. So we need to ensure that we do as much as we can to limit the introduction of these invasive species, but we also need to ensure healthy ecosystems, which will be more resilient to the invasions of these other species. Now, one of the things that's projected to happen through these models of plant distribution is a loss of distinctiveness of Florida's ecosystems. As I mentioned, we have something like 80 different communities based on the vegetation types, the interactions of species of plants, plus all of the animals and fungi that those habitats support. Now, what's going to happen as certain species maybe become locally extinct and others are able to move to different locations? Some species, like that scrub plum, look like they could do well anywhere. So what does that mean for these communities? It means that our communities are going to become much more homogeneous, much more similar to each other, losing this distinctiveness that our habitats are known for. So this is a real threat to our native biodiversity. And of course, all of these changes to plant diversity have many consequences for wildlife, such as the loss of habitat, the loss of food, the loss of nesting sites, the protection that these habitats afford to both those animals and to other ecosystems. And of course, we see this with mangroves, but there are many other sorts of habitats that are similarly under threat with the same threats for the rest of biodiversity. So Florida's ecosystems are already changing. We see this when we compare our present biodiversity with biodiversity from just a few decades ago. The species are different. The distributions of those species are different. The composition of our communities is different. All of these things are happening, and they're happening now, as we heard earlier today, really in an instant. So all of this is happening very, very quickly. A lot of this is due to climate change, but not all of the threats to biodiversity are coming from climate change. In addition to climate change, we have changes in land use. We see this very pronouncedly in Florida, but this is a global problem as well. We also see invasive species, also, as we've mentioned. We also tend to have many other opportunities where we have direct exploitation of species through lumbering, through fishing, through various sorts of harvesting. And that's also leading to loss of biodiversity. And of course, there's pollution. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services actually identified all 5 of these components as driving the loss of biodiversity. So climate change, and I would say climate change, particularly in a place like Florida, is very, very important. But globally, there are these other impacts as well. Yeah. So what does all of this mean? This means that our conservation and management plans need to account for the climate of the future. I've been really impressed with some of the forestry programs in British Columbia, Canada. So there, as part of their reforestation processes, they're planting Douglas fir and the plants, the trees that they want to have as their forest components in the future, not where those forests are best suited currently, but where climate models and biodiversity models suggest those species will thrive in the future. So they're actually planting forests farther north and in areas that the models say should be successful in the future. So our conservation and management plans need to account for the climate of the future so that any of these activities that we're talking about today and that many of us are all involved with will be as effective as possible. So I'd just like to acknowledge lots of folks with whom I conducted this work. Charlotte, Jermaine Aubrey, Julie Allen, and Mackenzie Mabry are all awesome postdocs. Rob Gralnick is one of my colleagues, and Doug Soltis is also one of my colleagues, but he's also my husband. And I got lots of great photos from various sources, so I tried to acknowledge them on the slides. I'd also like to acknowledge the National Science Foundation for funding this research, including having funded something called iDigBio, which is the National Center for Digitization of Biodiversity Collections. This has been operating at UF as the National Center for the last 15 years, and this has provided us with a lot of resources that we can use for doing these studies of biodiversity. So with that, I'll say thanks very much, and I'm happy to take some questions.
The light for the questions, and that is, last example you get, it's exactly what climate adaptation is all about. Because we took the climate information, we considered it, and we did something different so that when the climate changes, the forests in British Columbia are going to be more diverse. That's a climate adaptation. And if we do that all along in the future, we're going to end up in a great place. And that's why I think you're excited and positive, like I am, and like Ken is, because with this information, we can design the future we want.
All right. Doctor. Thank you. Thank you for this exciting presentation. Two things come to mind, and they all center around money. The wine industry and the orange industry. Now, of course, wine industry must be changing. There was an article some time ago that maybe England is going to have better wines than France. Where in your program, how do you see the wine industry changing, and more specifically in Florida, how do you see the orange trees changing?
Yeah, those are really good points and really good examples. There is a lot of modeling and environmental testing going on within the wine industry. I'm actually more familiar with what's happening there just because of the types of publications that come out and some of the presentations that I've been able to hear. So there are multiple ways that grapevines for wine can be susceptible to climate change. One is through the roots, and the other is through the vegetative part. So usually the rootstock comes from some very hardy species, and then grafted onto that is something that will then make the leaves that'll be good for photosynthesis, and then make the fruits that are going to be good for the wines. Those roots and those above ground parts may not respond in the same way to changing climate. And so there's a lot of research going on into what are the best rootstocks for the future, because as climate warms and gets in some areas actually wetter, those rootstocks might be more susceptible to pathogens. So there's additional pathogen pressure on the roots. So people are studying that. And then for the above ground part, how are those, especially the fruits, fruit production responding to climate? So there's a lot of very complex research that's addressing exactly those questions that you're raising. And yes, the best wine areas might be farther north than what we expect right now, or maybe higher elevation if you're in California or something like that. So yeah, again, these are, I think, examples of this climate adaptation that Bob just mentioned. With regard to some of the citrus problems in Florida, so much of this is related to to invasive species, whether it's a virus or a bacterium or some other disease that continues to be. It seems like we just see wave after wave of these sorts of things, and they may or may not actually be much related to climate. So I don't think too many of the things that I described today will be relevant there, but certainly how the citrus industry is studying the receptiveness and the resilience to these different pathogens that come in is really important. So, yeah, thanks for your question.
Okay, Pam, over here. Do you know of any examples of plants adapting and changing such that they show up as almost a new species as the climate environment changes?
So this actually it's a really good question. This actually gets back to a point that Bob raised earlier as well, which is that typically our species can't adapt fast enough to actually to show this sort of change. But there are plants that have very short life cycles, annual plants, or even actually in some habitats more rapid than one life cycle per year. And they have been shown to be able to adapt to changing climates. And so, it's possible that some small herbaceous species might be able to adapt. In the examples that I've seen, they haven't been referred to as new species yet. But, these are experiments that have maybe only been going on for a decade or so. So it's highly possible. And this whole concept of Florida as a refugium, one of the reasons why we have such high plant diversity in Florida is because it was a refuge during the glacial periods, so that all these other species moved south. And then, and this is also instantaneous, but not on the same time scale that you're asking about, when the species moved back northward, the remnants that stayed in Florida actually have been recognized as new species. They were so distinct from everything that moved forward. So that contributes to a lot of our biodiversity. But that's over a span of maybe like 10,000 years, not a century. So, but species can arise very quickly.
Pam, we have another question over here.
Okay. Let's see.
Hey, so actually, thank you for doing this research. My company, Stalking Savvy, has been doing this proactive planting for many years now. And when research like this comes out, it actually helps us improve profit margins because we're doing less guesswork as we're trying to do this. So thank you. And I also recommend, iDigBio has also partnered with iNaturalist. It's a great way for the public to get involved. The data is very easily downloaded for researchers. And if people in this room would like to see examples of this, we're actually doing a project or a public walk with the Florida Native Plant Society at Welland Park next Saturday. So you can come see this. This is already being done by certain land managers, and programs like this just make them all the more effective. So it's pretty cool. And as far as the biggest issue, it's usually I find high heat and dry periods long-term are the biggest issue. And that as sites grow in, they become less vulnerable to those quick cold snaps. So you're more planning on the heat and wetland issues in my experience. But thank you for what you're doing.
Yeah. Thanks very much for your comment. And I'll just add quickly that I've participated in some workshops and in some initial stages of research where we're applying these same sorts of methods for the Florida native nurseries. And so the nurseries are really interested. Some nurseries are really interested in this sort of information so that they can project which genotypes might perform best under future climate conditions. I've also been working with a guy who's an amazing, he's literally a genius. He was a physicist, but now he's decided to take on, using AI, he's developing these amazing models for how to predict what to put in your very own backyard based on the soil, the climate, the slope, all of these sorts of things. And it looks like it has a lot of promise. And the idea would be that we could actually have an app and you could use it. It could be linked into native nurseries so you know where to go get the things that you should put in your own yard. So we're trying to make this work not just foundational science, but also have applications to all Floridians.
Over here?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm wondering if you have any recommendations on how we might be able to leverage the biodiversity of our community to help protect our vulnerable coastline against inevitable storm surge we unsubscribed this year, but the storms that will certainly affect us in the future.
Yeah, that's yeah. Yeah, so that's a really good and important question. There are multiple centers for biological resilience around the state where people are actually studying that in very specific detail. And it sounds like there's going to be discussion about that here next year at next year's conference. I'm not an expert in that area. I just know that there's a group studying coastal resilience around Jacksonville and other groups around in the Panhandle. Along the Gulf Coast of the peninsula here, also farther south, and then around the Miami area as well. So I could look into some actual resources, but definitely not an expert in that area.
Okay, last question. And by the way, Michelle unsubscribed from Netflix and hurricanes on the Suncoast this year. I didn't know you could do that, but thank you, Michelle. We all appreciate that. Guillermo has a question.
Thank you, Rick. I just wanted to make a brief comment regarding what you mentioned. We have just finished a study of the impact of mangroves in the Philippines on reducing premiums for communities on the coast that are protected by these systems. And the reduction that we've modeled is in the order of 15 to 20%. I mean, it's not reducing the premium to zero, but it is reducing it to a point where it makes sense to actually invest in the repopulation of these species along the coast, right?
Yeah, that's an excellent comment. Thank you for that. And I guess I'll just comment briefly that we have modeled the mangrove species as well. And with mangroves, because people have been interested in them for so long, we actually have a lot of previous information so we can hindcast and ground truth the validity of our models. And our models work really well. So when we project that mangroves are going to move north, we can be very confident in that because of the fact that we know how they've responded in the past. The scary thing about mangroves is that even though the mangroves seem to be able to tolerate projected climate and that they probably will be fine as long as there's available habitat, a lot of the species in the salt marsh that are just behind the mangroves in any mangrove community are not projected to do well. And so if there's going to be some concentrated planting of mangroves, the effort should be to include those other species as well so that we can strengthen that whole community and increase their resilience. So maybe you could get up to 25% improvements then. So yeah. Thanks.
Pam, thank you. That was
Sure.
incredible.
Thank you so much.